to start by reading Dr. Obotashaka's bio. And then I'm just going to turn it over to him. And around about 6 o'clock, we're going to take question and answers. So I'm just going to read his bio, just some points, because it's very extensive. He's done a lot. He's done a lot for our community, and he's done a lot in terms of education and organization. So Dr. Obotashaka is an activist, scholar, public speaker, professor, workshop leader, author, organizer, and visionary. For 38 years, he was professor of Black and Africana Studies at San Francisco State University, and now he serves as professor emeritus at San Francisco State University. He's the founder of the National Black United Front, national vice chairman between 1984 to 2009. He is the principal architect of the African-centered education movement, which incorporated an African-centered model curriculum in the U.S. public school education while he chaired Black Studies at San Francisco State, and thus incorporated natural sciences into the core discipline of Black Studies and led the move to define African philosophy as the foundation of Africana Black Studies. In addition to teaching, he is also leading Operation We Are Family, a major global organizing drive to unify Black people and revitalize Black families in the US and globally. He has a show, and the show, for all those who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, their history, their culture, their politics, spirituality, and family relations. This is a show for all who are seeking the truth, including the Black Power and hip hop generations. Dr. Obotashaka and his guests, who will include leading hip hop artists and thinkers, Black Power and Black Lives Matter activists, and scholars will be dropping by. We'll be dropping knowledge and insights from their artistic work, successful organizing, research, writings, teachings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. There's so much to his life and his organizational prowess. His name, Oba, is the Yoruba word for king, and he always carries himself very regally and very royally. He's a man to be greatly admired and respected. And without further ado, I want to introduce my teacher, Seba, Dr. Obotashaka.
Thank you, brother. Are you going to put me on the full screen, or how's that going to work?
Okay, let me, okay, yes. Hold just a second. Where'd you go? Oh, yeah, let's see.
Or share screen.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
All right.
Okay. Thanks, Brother Imhotep. I didn't know that he would go on to become a spiritual leader, and I'm really proud of your work and the good work you've done with your family as well. And my wife is associated with WOZE in Oakland, you know. And as chair of Black Studies, I would bring in speakers, Ivan Van Sertima and others, and the condition was I had to speak in the community. It was usually at WOZE, you know. And driving to WOZE, that's in Oakland, I got all kinds of interesting information, you know. Especially Ivan Van Sertima. In fact, it affected how I'm writing the book I'm finishing now on Seba. It's at 643 pages. It's a replacement pedagogy. We have the contradiction of having African-centered thought, which is not a contradiction, and a Eurocentric method for teaching it, and writing it, and thinking it. And so we often have Eurocentrism in the disguise of African-centered thought and don't even know it. You know what I mean? And if you're thinking the way they think, even though the facts sound different, you end up in the same place. So that's a piece that I'm working on now. So greeting to Woze Community Church, Sacramento. My topic is revitalizing Black families through the African twin lineal family model that's described in this book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, the most difficult thing I've done in my life. I've led some organizing campaigns that were rough and tough, beating the largest bank in the world, the Bank of America, leading the only successful Black freedom or Black power movement in the North, the San Francisco Freedom Movement. You don't, most of you know about it. We're the mother movement of all the movements. And by the way, the last show on the Dr. Obatashaka show, I interviewed Emory Douglas, former Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party, on the launching of the Black Panther Party. This show today will end up on my show Saturday. The following Saturday will be part 2 with Emory Douglas. So the topic has got to do with twin lineal families and how we revitalize our families today. Between 1865 and 1968, Black families proved to be real resilient. A lot of us don't know that, some of us do. From the period of Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction, Jim Crow, World War I, World War II, up to 1968, 75% of the members of Black families were male and female, and 75% of our people were married. It's 2-parent households. In fact, the rate of marriage for Blacks was higher than the rate of marriage for whites, contrary to popular opinion. I'm not going into the popular opinion right now. And not only did we have 2-parent households intact, but we also had extended family communities where Black children were raised not only by their immediate family, but by the extended family community, meaning by people not their blood relatives, but were treated that way. And so the community basically raised the children. I'm gonna give an overall picture, and I'm not suggesting that everything was perfect. Black families had their contradictions. It was rough and tough. But the fact is, our people held in there. In my case, up until 7 years of age, I was raised in the Fillmore. When I was a little kid going to first grade, I broke the window of an old lady down the hill from where I lived on Bush Street. And so she gave me a whipping. And then when I went home, my mother gave me a whipping. And that's kind of the way Black communities socialized your butt. Whippings went too far. It was a legacy of slavery, but a certain amount of it was probably necessary. But you know, we need to get as far away from that as possible without getting into permissive child rearing of white folks, which just allows kids to do whatever they want to do. So the strength of the Black family and the Black extended family community were outgrowths of African cultural practices carried into the US. And one of the biggest shaping influences for Black people, and one of the reasons we could come out with our humanity intact, contrary to popular opinion, is the extended family community took up the slack when you were separated from mother, father, sister, and brother. And the key thing they gave you was love. This legacy of Africa is carried to Afro-America. These family practices were strengthened by institutions created by Blacks in the US, some in enslavement and many afterwards. And the key ones were the Black church, which is miserably understood by the nationalist community. It's one institution that Blacks own, and the most African of the institutions we have other than the Black family, noting their contradictions. So the Black church, the Black school, the institution of elderhood, which was transplanted from Africa to America and the Caribbean, South America, wherever we were. These institutions, especially the institution of elderhood, provided wisdom for our people. Wisdom was always checked by the will of the group. Elders could not just automatically impose their will, but we listened and often followed their will. And these institutions helped carry us through the tribulations of racist oppression. I don't call it white supremacy because whites are in decline in the world now. And I'm not into empowering them. Every battle I fought, and I fought many over 63 years, my size 13 has gone up the ass of the most powerful institutions in this country, including the CIA and FBI that's tried to cancel my clock 3 times. You understand? So I'm not into this victimhood stuff. Come after me, you're the victim. You hear me? And I don't have no stress. Look at me. I enjoy a fight. I'm not looking for one, but I enjoy one. It's a game for me. Stakes are your life, not mine, you know? So a central value that was transmitted to our children by the Black family, Black church, Black elders, Black teachers, Black leaders, and by Black literary writers was this value of race first. And this value of race first came out of race consciousness, an original contribution of Africans in the US because of the way in which oppression worked here. We're the most race conscious Africans on the planet. If you see race conscious Africans in Africa, they were exposed to us. And generally their leaders had to come here and get exposed to it. Hopefully they got enough to get some sense. It's not necessary though that Africans have to have race consciousness. They're not in a situation where you're being hung by the trees with the greatest of ease. So it's not like something, well, it's just wonderful, we have it. But as a result, we made something like slop gullion, a mixture of different things. Well, this is one of the things we took and it became a new recipe and it united us. No race consciousness, no Garvey movement, for example. And race consciousness was a source of race pride. And generally our parents would teach us, as the recent Supreme Court appointee was taught by her parents, you can do anything anybody else can do, but you can do it better. That was the Black teachings, you hear me? Still is, but we're gonna see it's been eroded. The ultimate value taught by Black parents, Black teachers, and Black leaders to Black youth was expressed by the author of The Invisible Man, one of the classic works, where the protagonist passes out after getting off the subway in New York, and a stranger, an old Black woman, took him into her home, healed him, because this is the extended family community. And then when she lets him go, before he goes, she says, I just want one thing from you. She said, I want you to do something great for our people. That was a part of race consciousness, still is, but it was stronger then. John Henry Clark said that he was inspired by his teachers, and he was very glad to be in the Black Brigade because in his school you had the Light Brigade based on the brainwashing of slavery taught by light-skinned Black teachers, and the Dark Brigade taught by Black-skinned Black teachers. And he was so glad he was in the Dark Brigade because when he was goofing off and following the peer groups in his class, one of his teachers at lunchtime brought him in by himself, not to embarrass him. And when he's looking down, she put her thumb on his chin and she said, young man, in the world, it doesn't matter if you're alone, but you can't be the fool following the group, follow the truth. And then she said what put John on his course in life. She said, I expect great things of you. And that again inspired John Henry Clark. And when he's going to jump on a freight train, you know, hoboing to New York by way of Chicago, Miss Chicken Leg, who was a lady of the night, who was a lady that helped take care of him, who went to parent meetings representing him. She stuck her head out the window and she said, this little, I don't use that word, but this little N is going to do something great with his life. And John said, I didn't know if I liked that because I didn't know if I could live up to that expectation. That was the same thing that the protagonist said in Invisible Man. You know what I mean? So John was propelled by the big mamas. as he pointed out, who put him on the course of his life, starting with his great-grandmother, who taught him about Africa and about his great-great-great-grandfather, Buck, who bucked the white boy and kicked his butt. And so John got that spirit of Africa. He wasn't a physical fighter himself, but his fighting was through his words, his teachings, and his writings. So this was the nature of the Black community, teaching both African and what I call new African values, the values created here during and after the enslavement process. The central value taught by Black families and Black extended family communities was the value of self-knowledge, self-respect, self-love, and self-discipline. Now, all parents didn't teach this, but the core of our people did. And basically, Black parenting was based on discipline, which we know about that discipline. In the Caribbean, it's called heavy manners, slaps and licks. Again, I say too much of that.
Yeah.
But discipline was designed to teach self-discipline so that you could prosper in the world by doing something great. Because one of the lessons I've learned in life, the two keys to success, and I don't define success the way most people do, is good character, hard work. All those other things, whatever you got, you work with them. But those are the two keys in life, you know? I've never lost a battle. Hard work, I prepare before a battle. You are defeated before I've ever fought you. I've never lost a battle. And I fought some rough, tough ones, because I'm not fighting you unless I can whip you. I'm not fighting no losing battles. Winning is the only name of the game, and it's got to be a just cause. So our families instilled that. While most Black families globally, African, African American, were materially poor, they were culturally rich. And the richest part of the culture that we carried out, and my wife, Pamela Hurley Tashaka, says in the Caribbean, they have a term for that, poor great. Materially poor, great people. And when you see our people all over the world, you would think that people that didn't have a pot to piss in a window to throw it out were materially rich and owned the world because of the way they carried themselves. You know what I mean? And so this was the nature and still is the nature of our people, though again, this is eroded, it has eroded. And so the greatest inheritance that we carried from Africa, that Du Bois describes as the souls of Black folks, was the gift from God of spirit. That's the greatest gift. And most of our historians want to dismiss it because they'll say all people have spirit in common. True, up to a point, but only certain cultures are spirit-based. And African and African American, African Caribbean, African cultures are grounded in spirit, which is the spirit of God that resides within each of us. So this presentation is entitled Revitalizing Black Families Through African Twin-Lineal Family Model. Since 1968, the conditions I've just described have been altered. By what? Hostile forces that have hit Black communities since 1968. I've written a book called The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures that describes those forces. That's what we're going through right now. It is a big mistake of African scholars, African American scholars, to attribute all the ills in the Black community to slavery. We have some ills now that are post-1968 ills that have nothing to do with slavery. And I'll describe a few of them. And those are ones that we have to address, along with the hangovers from slavery. So addressing the twin lineal family model as a way to revitalize Black families is speaking to how we're going to draw on that to strengthen families and communities and people that have been weakened by the forces that have hit us in the post-1968 period. By the way, King was assassinated in 1968. Malcolm in 1965. The world that changes in Black communities are fundamentally different from what they had faced. They would have had to completely readjust almost their approaches to organizing, leadership, and everything else in this post-1968 period. So these forces hit Black families, Black extended family communities, and this comes from God, piping into God's mind, causing, quote, a choice between two cultures. Those are God's words. They don't come from me. And anyone that has heard me go through this, and I won't go through it much today, if they're organizers, if they're scholars, I don't care what they are, they will all come back and say, it's a choice between two cultures. Because if you're going to explain some of the mad behavior going on in our communities right now, this explains it. Comes from God, piping into God's mind. You know what I mean? So the values of spirituality, human life over money, these are all the values we carried from Africa, adapted to this country. Spirituality, human life over money, the value of the group over the individual, the value of high expectations, the sense of optimism, no matter how bad things are, they'll get better. The old sayings that we carry out in our community, every dog has its day, you know what I mean? That accounts for the low suicide rates in Black communities compared to white communities, even though it's rising with Black youth, except for 7 to 11-year-olds, and that's terrible. It's really telling you something's going wrong. The suicide rates in Black community are lower than among any other people in this country. And that's due to the persistence of these values and this culture that we created in this country. So no matter how bad things are, we had this idea that things could get better. We drew from elders who gave us wisdom, and we had a high regard for it. And we had a high value for Black women, even though there was abuse of women in families. I'm not ignoring that, but I'm saying there's high value for Black women. And the Black church, the Black family, and the Black school outweighed peer groups. That's no longer the case. You hear me? And that is not caused by slavery. In fact, we created or carried over from Africa extended family communities and held a high respect for elders. And the idea that somebody that having 2 cents between their ears is going to dictate what you do was foreign to us, even though the youth might try, you know? So the forces that hit us, and I'm not going through all of them, I'm just going to earmark the key ones. And these were very hard for us to resist, because part of the reason, part of the question is, how is it that we go from 2-parent households, 75% of our families are 2-parent households, to today where only 29% of our families are 2-parent households. The Black family eroded more between 68 and now than between 1619 and 1968, let alone the Reconstruction period of 1865 to 1968. So that means that the forces that have hit us have been more difficult for us to handle than those other forces that we faced before. And one of the most difficult forces that we were not wired for was globalization. Some of our people still don't know what that is, you know what I mean? And it has many meanings. I'm not going into all of it, but for the Black family, the biggest effect and devastating effect of globalization was taking manufacturing jobs out of the country and sticking them overseas or in the suburbs. 20% of the Black workforce was, made up of industrial workers, Blacks. That's considerably more than our percentage in the population. So when those jobs go, then the real foundation for a lot of Black families, where Black men could support their families with women working and sometimes without them working, went out. And then when that went out, then what ends up happening is the disappearance of the Black male in the Black family. In the book, Return to the African Mother Principle, I give documentation on this. Between 1976 and 1982, 700,000 jobs were lost among Blacks. 700,000 Black men were out of the family. No finance, no romance. And one of the things I do study is economics. You're in America, you better know something about money. No money, no honey. there might be honey for a while, but it ain't gonna last unless there's some money.
Lodge Daly.
Ain't got a cent to pay the rent, and we're gonna make it. My question is how? And in most cases, that means it ain't gonna be through no marriage, you know? So the average brother is making $20,000 a year. Now there's a average is average. So part above, part below, and then we have others who are above. But a large sector of our people are making 20,000 or less. And sisters ain't doing much better on that if they don't have college degree. And even sometimes then it doesn't translate to a college paying job. The average Black person with a high school, a college education makes what the average white boy makes with a high school education. You do know that. I know you know that. Therefore, this is the main reason that we see Black households now, only 29% are two parents. Now, we have all kinds of ways to making families now. So I'm not suggesting there are no families, committed relationships and in between, every kind of relationship is going on. So the CIA admits that they dropped drugs in the Black community and had an intentional consequence of putting in a culture. Now, the choice between two cultures, that was not intended. We give white people too much credit for everything that happens. They didn't think we had a culture, so why would they try and produce a choice between two cultures? This was unintended consequences. But in the case of drugs, this was intended. You know that if you get people hooked, you're into a drug world of death, savagery, and barbarism. And if you break up communities, which was a part of what hit us in the post-68 period, the Fillmore was the rich base for our struggle, San Francisco freedom movement. You had the rich Harlem, which was like the capital of Afro-America. Those, particularly the Fillmore, ain't there anymore. Gentrified, redeveloped, you know what I mean? And so as a result of that, then that means Black businesses destroyed, those mansions that our people lived in that they call slums, you know what I mean? When those are gone, then what ends up happening is people are looking for a living, and sometimes that living becomes gangbanging, drug dealing. The easiest way to get a gangbanger out of gangbanging is give them a good job. They're gone, you know? They're law-abiding citizens overnight. I know that the movement that we led, that's what we produced, thousands of jobs for Blacks. As bad as gangster values are, my former student Imhotep was referring to Lodge Daly. He had his favorite poem, America the Pimp. This ain't like pimping on the street. That's mild stuff. When you're talking about pimping, well, that's a nice name for it, but it is beyond gangsterism. It's global. It's deadly. It puts people on $2 a day globally, while a handful of people own the planet. And so the worst thing that hit our community was the corporate values that created a new type of human being with it, subhuman, where material things matter more than life itself. And in the choice between two cultures, as our youth are put in the position of choosing between two cultures and not knowing they have a culture, and that's the failure of too many of our scholars that have studied, those that are Afrocentric have studied ancient Africa, but not studied Afro-America. And those that have studied Afro-America have not systematically studied the culture. There has never been a systematic evaluation of African-American culture, because the brainwashed nationalist thinks, and too many Blacks think, we lost it in slavery. BS. Dogs have culture. You hear me? Everybody on the planet has a culture, and you created one of the greatest ones on the planet. Is the popular culture of the world and the classical culture of the world. And we created an art form at the same time. What enslaved Black people have time to sing, even though they weren't happy while they were singing. You understand? So the thing is, when we look at these hostile forces that have hit our communities, put our youth in an unenviable position of choosing between two cultures, often not even knowing the culture they have to choose from. You hear me? And it's our task to wade in the water of both African and African-American culture so they understand it. So one of the big choices they get faced with is the choice between the material culture of the Aryan or the European and the spiritual material culture of the African and the African American. And too often now, when they have those choices, the material one wins out too often. Or the choice between the individual and the group. My generation placed the group above the individual. The majority of youth place the individual above the group. And that's because of the intrusion of external forces. So this is what we have to deal with. To revitalize our community, we got to draw from the best of our new African cultural values and the best of African values, because as these forces have hit our community, there's a need for revitalization of our values. So we have to do like the Sankofa bird in Ghana and draw from our historical past the best so that we can move forward with those models to revitalize our families, communities, and people today and tomorrow. And the key objective has to be to create just societies. We have to have long-term vision. This isn't just about survival. A long-term vision means restructuring the society. I'm a revolutionary. Among the African-centered scholars, as Dr. Obenga said, I'm the only one. I said, well, that ain't something that I find too great to hear, but I already knew it. And the African-centered scholars still doing good work. But as a revolutionary, I'm a systems person. So I've innovated 6 systems. These systems are about taking your past, applying it to the present, and then the future. And because at some point, Black, brown, and red and yellow are going to be a majority in this country, and we're going to run this place. But some of us, because we're infected by white-itis, don't think so. You hear me? Oh, white-itis has got us to think that, oh, mighty whitey, he's going to be around forever. Everything that goes up comes down. Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and Humpty Dumpty not only had a great fall, you couldn't put him back together again. And you're in the process of Humpty Dumpty falling right now before your eyes. And as Malcolm said, what makes them sad makes me glad. And I got enough sense to know how to protect. They birthed the civilization. They did. And so as a result of that, they created the highest civilizations on the planet and the highest level of humanity on the planet. So those shows went into origin because we've generally ignored them when it comes to origin of history. We left them out. So what I didn't cover in that series was the basis for just societies, and particularly the basis for just family systems, just political systems, just economic systems, coming from the Twa or the Kung people, the mitochondrial DNA, which is the best evidence for human origin, because that's the DNA of the mother. It doesn't disappear. Mitochondrial DNA shows humanity begins in Africa among the Kung and Biaka Twa, but the Kung are the longest living Kung or San people of Kalahari Desert. 144,000 years ago, give or take 10,000 years, that's the error rate of mitochondrial DNA. And I'm into evidence, but I'm also into ideas and thoughts that are accurate. So I'm not just a fact man, you know what I mean? And so mitochondrial DNA to me is the lodestar. And you can look at hominids and everything else, but they vary. And you're getting a bone here and a bone there. But mitochondrial DNA says the first human beings were Kung people or Twa coming out of the Kalahari Desert, one of the roughest places on the planet to live. And so from them comes the model for just families, just societies, just villages, just nations. The resilience of Black families in Africa, the United States, the Caribbean, South America, the South Pacific, Europe, and Asia is because they draw from this family model, as well as other African cultural precepts. We just didn't know what it was. And so we don't know what we were drawn from. And that's the discovery of the mother principle. It's a big fat breakthrough right here. It is key to resurrecting just societies right here. You hear me? And so we've been resilient. That's why Black families could stay so strong for over 100 years after emancipation and throughout the enslavement period. And why we could come out of slavery more humane than the people who did us in. And I'm sick and tired of hearing historians talk about we were chattels in slavery. That was their view, not ours. You hear me? Property my butt. Property doesn't cut your throat the way Nat Turner did. A property doesn't break your implements. You hear me? A property doesn't run away. You hear me? A property doesn't love. A property don't have no nobility of spirit. A property doesn't create. Pure bull. You hear me? So this resilience comes from that. Now here's a key thing. I'm gonna give some evidentiary things on the side and then get into the main thing. When you look at the people who were the ancestors of the Romans, those are Etruscans, Etruscan. They're Black people living in the area of Italy. What distinguished them from the Aryan? High value for women. You hear me? High value for women. They're coming out of this African family model. Or the Pelagians, who are the ancestors of the Greeks, not physically, but geographically, first people in Greece. What distinguishes them from the Greeks? High value for women. Or the Dalits, formerly called Dravidians in India. What did they say about the woman? They said, we can only get freedom through the woman. Huh. So you know you're in the presence of civilized people, but you're in the presence of the African family model. And of course, now we have this B word being used to describe Black women, and a few Black women falling for it and calling them that themselves. So that is about as serious as the erosion gets, but most Black people know not to do that. When I was a kid growing up, I never did the dozens because I didn't want, number one, I had respect for Black women, but number two, you ain't doing it on mine. You hear me? Because if you do, it's war. You hear me? In fact, as a young man, you know, my girlfriends, I had one at a time in the movement, you know, I mean, I have a lot of them, but you'd never hear anything about it. Why? It's none of your business. That's private. You hear me? Now we put too much of private stuff in public. That's how Oprah got to be a multi-billionaire. Get me on, Oprah. You ain't hearing nothing about my family, even though it's great. It's none of your business. You hear me? It's private. You hear me? So even when Africans took on religions, not our own, like Islam, particularly in West Africa, what distinguished the African practice of Islam from the Arab or other people? High respect for wisdom. Ibn Khaldun, a Arab historian, when traveling through Mali, observed, and this bothered him to a great degree. This part didn't. He observed these were the finest women he had ever seen. Black as midnight. That didn't bother him. What bothered him was the most treasured people in Malian society that happened to be Islamic were women. He couldn't deal with that. You hear me? Huh? So I'm giving you a hint of where this family model goes. The Anu, the great ones of Kemet, which I picture on my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by choice between two cultures. The Anu meant great ones, named after Ani, which was a Tsar, who was a real live person. I actually have a picture of his carving, you know, and I date it to around 6,500 BC. I'm a specialist in ancient Kemet. I know Kemetic history, but I'm into what hasn't been covered, because if people have done this stuff well, I'm not going to do their stuff. I'm going to study it, but mine is the ancient stuff, because I'm a revolutionary, so I'm interested in the most just stuff. You hear me? That's why I focus on the Twa, the most just stuff. So the Anu, who are the founders of ancient Kemet, land of the Blacks. By the way, when Diop and Obenga argued at UNESCO, it was the Anu that they used as the argument for the origin of Kemetic civilization, Pharaonic civilization, being Black. That was them. You hear me? They didn't really care they were Twa. They just cared that they were Black, because that's the argument they were making. I care about both because they happen to be the source of just societies, just family systems, just economic systems, just political systems. So they called themselves the great ones. As Muhammad Ali said, I'm the greatest, before he knocked anyone significant out, but he was a Golden Gloves champion and he had 100 bouts. He knew something we didn't know, but it wasn't just that he was the greatest boxer, though that's debatable. Sugar Ray Robinson is considered the greatest boxer by most boxing experts. I'm not one, so I can't mediate on that. But Muhammad Ali based his style on Sugar Ray Robinson. And if you notice, when he knocked out Sonny Liston at the weigh-in, who was there? Sugar Ray Robinson. When he won the battle and was talking about, I'm the prettiest and I'm the greatest, who was there grinning? Sugar Ray Robinson, who was actually prettier than him, contrary to popular opinion. You know what I mean? So these great ones were great because they gave birth to the greatest classical civilization in the world, but they were great because they were great people. And what made them great was their justness. And their greatness traces back to their ancestors, because they're Twa, but they're agrarian Twa by the time they found ancient Kemet. But these ancient Twa that they have as their ancestors are hunter-gatherers, going back 144,000 years ago. So all innovative breakthroughs in the realms of science, mathematics, music, history, social science, and all areas come from two things: knowing facts about something, and that's what most scholars end up being, factual consumers and repeating facts. But the innovation comes from knowing the facts, but through intuitive breakthroughs. Without intuitive breakthroughs, there are no innovations in any area. Whether you're talking about chemistry, mathematics, whether you're talking about quantum physics, whether you're talking about family studies, history, whatever, those innovations come from piping into God's mind. I've had the privilege of doing it twice, and what I get from there, I am humbled to say it didn't come from me, it came through me. And there's no holes in it. And when you do innovation, when God rewards you, then what you find is the facts fall in line. It's easily verifiable. And so in my case, the innovation of the African family system, the twin African family system, came about through years of battles for just societies. It came about through years of study of African and African-American history, culture, a whole bunch of different areas. It came about through years of working internally on myself. I went through 15 months of working on the feminine side of myself, 3 months a year for 5 years. You hear me? Working on myself. I went on retreats for 3 months a year. And it's after this that this vision comes. And that's a part of purification. I'm not pure. I'm not like George Washington Carver, who was piping into God all the time. That's why he was the greatest scientist of the 20th century. He knew, you know, plants, you know, botany. By the way, he was an artist, a musician, a singer, a painter, as well as a master scientist. But he was piping into God's mind, as he called it, thinking God's thoughts all the time. Einstein made him the second greatest scientist in the world. He was actually the greatest. Einstein was second because Einstein had one innovation. George Washington Carver had so many, you can't count them. You hear me? And none of them used to harm human beings. A very humble and wonderful human being. Einstein was a good human being too, by the way. So in my case, the vision of the just society comes through the beautiful light. God, by the way, is a beautiful white light. The great Lakota healer, holy man, Fool's Crow, got to travel to the highest realm of heaven. You know, there's realms of heaven. I'm an astrologer, by the way. I'm into spirit stuff, you know, so I'm a little spooky for some people, but for others, it's real deal stuff. But so I haven't had the privilege of going to the highest realm of heaven because I'm not on that plane. But the message that I received from God was through the white light, which is God, the most beautiful experience of my life. But Fool's Crow actually traveled to the highest heaven and sometimes would stay there for 2 days. Now, if you understand anything about heaven, it's beyond space and time. And so you can get stuff in heaven in milliseconds that would take you years to get here, like what I'm going to share with you on the Just Societies. I spent a lifetime coming up with this and couldn't get it. But in a millisecond, I got it through the beautiful light. But imagine somebody who's there for 2 days. And by the way, your spirit's left the body. That's the Ba. And if it doesn't come back, you're dead. And what did he say about the highest realm? A guy who was interviewing him on this book called Fool's Crow, he said, so they asked him, what did God look like? He said, a great white light. A great white light. You hear me? And those who pass to the other side, that's what they pass to. So for me, my experience in terms of the intuitive realm has been through the light. It's been the most rewarding experience of my life. It changed me, but it was after doing a lot of work. But people who observed me later would see the change. I just knew that I was pleased to have had the opportunity to visit God's mind, which is a whole mind, the whole of a part. And so without speaking, when I've had these experiences, I don't hear any words. It's telepathic. And without speaking, God revealed telepathically when I asked, because I was writing this book, The Mother Principle, I asked, what's the basis for just societies? And God said, without speaking, the just societies, and this comes from God, of Africa were societies where, and this is God speaking, all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. All the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society, period. God is the greatest speaker on the planet, even when he's not, it is not talking. It talks on your level. So God didn't tell me who these people were. God knew I'd know. I knew that was the Twa. And no anthropologists, historians, or anything else have figured this out. This is the secret to Twa Just Society, along with their purity of character and the fact that they radiate God's light because they're the closest human beings to God, being the first to come to this earth, you know? But if you think about a just society, what's the basis for it? Well, if you have a system of empowerment where males have no more power than females and females have no more power than males, then that's a perfect definition. I'd have never come up with that. It's too simple. You know what I mean? Intellectuals like to, I don't, but normally, you know, you expect things that are profound to be complex. You hear me? So this is the key to just societies. Men didn't have any more power than women. Women didn't have any more power than men. And so these were the hunter-gatherer societies. The longest living that humans lived in was the most just on the planet Earth. No slavery, no oppression of women, no oppression of children, no oppression of elders, and freedom. Of course, we're into the material world now, so we don't want to live in that, right? But the reality is their needs were easily met. hunting and gathering didn't take much time, and the rest was leisure. That's why people lived in it for about 120,000 years. Huh? White boy comes along with his private property and his ownership of everything, including people. You hear me? And it got us infected with that, not of owning people, but of owning things, to the point they're more important than people. So this is the basis for the just societies of hunter-gatherer societies. And then this is passed on to subsequent African societies. And in the integration trap, I point out that these societies in the beginning, after and during the hunter-gatherer, but after the Twa innovate agriculture, you go to the integration trap, I go into a documentation of this, then these are societies without kings and queens in the beginning, and then later societies with kings and queens. And the early societies incline towards the woman. They have male-female balance, and because the societies of Africa that were just, where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society, it means that Africa gave birth to democracy, not the Greeks. Of course, the word democracy is a Greek word, but the concept of ruling through the people, it only happened for 125 or so years in Athens and a few city-states, 25,000 people, picked by lots. And oftentimes those societies were manipulated by the rich. But African societies inherited this so that all historians on Africa that are African agree that the African basis of democracy is consensus. All the males and females have to be in agreement. That is the African basis for democracy. And if you're looking at the model that groups like that have fought around police brutality, theirs have been models where not a single leader, group leadership. That comes from Ella Baker, Black Lives Matter. They're drawing from that same model, whether they know it or not. So this has been the basis for just society. So I describe these as twin lineal. Dr. Obenga said that term should be in the dictionary. By the way, Dr. Obenga said the mother principles are classic, but the term twin lineal should be in the dictionary. So what did twin lineal mean? I called it twin lineal because your lineage is twin. That is, you're descended from both mother and father, grandmother and grandfather. It's not matrilineage, just descended from the mother, or patrilineage, not descended just from the father. And Africans did not use those terms, matrilineage, patrilineage, matriarchy, or patriarchy. Those are anthropological terms. So Africans didn't use them because they came out of twin philosophies. And so twin lineal on one level means twin inheritance. On another level, it means twin empowerment. That is through consensus, male and female. And it means twin naming. And by the way, one of the practices that we have in Black communities is to take, for sisters, to take masculine names and feminize them. That's a part of the twin lineal inheritance, you know? Jonita, J-O, and then they put that feminine thing on it, you know what I mean? Or Charles-Cena, my first wife, Charles-Cena, you understand? That's your twin lineal heritage, you hear me? Or Sunjata, that meant child of Buffalo Woman and Lion King. In one name, he had both the mother and the father. That's a philosophy up inside of there. And the reason why you had this in America was a continuation of this twin mentality that twin linealism is based on, but also the fact that the father was the one that was most often going to disappear through sale. So you took on, you feminized the father's name to remember him. You hear me? That's some of your African stuff you think you don't have. So how can we use, and twin lineal also means lines of work, because hunter-gatherer societies, the men hunt, the women gather. And to this day, Africa's survival is based on women being the primary agriculturalists. though in the first societies that were created after hunter-gatherer, or even while it was going on, but when African hunter-gatherers innovated agriculture, men and women were agriculturalists. Men doing certain work, women doing others. But throughout most of Africa, it's the women who are the primary agriculturalists, and they're keeping Africa alive today. So the question is, how can we use this twin lineal model to aid us in revitalizing African American and African Caribbean, African South American, African Europe, African Asia, Africa South Pacific families? But ours is in the most need of it because of the way our families have been hit. You hear me? And so how can we use that to revitalize our families and our communities? The first is to understand how it persisted and continues in our life today. This is the first thing. You hear me? That's not in the mother principle, by the way. Twin lineal models persist in African American culture in a number of ways. What's the main ways? Africans in America do not like hierarchy, meaning we don't like anybody over us telling us what to do. Am I telling the truth? I know my people, by the way.
You're right, man.
We do not like people telling us what to do. It makes us very hard to organize, but it's right, because then a lot of wrong that's going to come from single individuals that get on power trips is going to be reduced substantially. And so why is this? Because by nature, we're democratic to the bone marrow. Black people are democratic by nature. That's your Twa inheritance, then translated to classless age grade societies. And if you look at the kings and queens, kings were always, Oba, what did that mean? King. Yeah, what did that mean? That meant that you were subject to the council of the Oba. And if the council made decisions, you didn't go along with it, you got 3 warnings. And the third time, you got a bowl with a parrot feather in it. And what did that mean? Kill yourself. That's called election and removal. And the Iroquois had a similar practice. If you read the mother principle, I show that the Iroquois was also based on a male-female system. And while the chiefs were the antlers, and they were the chiefs, they were responsible to the clan of women and clan of men. And when they went off and didn't follow the will of the clan of women or men, then the women's clan issued orders. And either one or two things would happen. The antlers would be taken off your head, or you'd be clubbed to death. You hear me? Right? I can think of a whole lot of representatives that needed to be taken out. Now I'm gonna have a few more minutes and I'll be finished.
All right.
Don't do that. What do we see then with Black folks? The democratic traditions of Black folks, when we come out of enslavement, dictate that the institutions we form that are popular, they have to have democratic input. So why did we pick the Baptist or Methodist churches? Because you could elect your own leaders and remove them. And sisters were predominant in that, as they still are today. Political organizations, if we look at the Montgomery bus boycott or the Garvey movement, why did the Montgomery bus boycott command 97% support of Black people? Because they had to say so. You hear me? And in the Garvey movement at the local level, men and women, you had a male president, a female president, a male vice president, female vice president. That's a con democracy. Garvey wasn't aware that that's what it was. And at the national level, he had to be elected in conventions. So our culture dictates that if you're going to get support among Black people, we'd better have a say-so in the groups that are formed. African-American culture, which was created by the grassroots, enslaved field Blacks created our culture, created our art form, and we should be proud of that. That was, again, a democratic innovation, and it was done this way. You had those who created something, in the case of the art form, for example, and they proposed, but it was the people who disposed. In other words, the people determined whether or not they liked it. And that's what determined whether or not something survived. You hear me? So the blues is an art form next to the spiritual blues. And what's that based on? The interaction of male and female voices, male and female lives. What makes it so interesting is that it's about the ups and downs, the woman that ain't got a man or a no good man, or wants to get a better man, you know what I mean? And the man whose blues is, I gave you everything and you don't respect me. The man's blues is always about what he's given you. And you know what the woman's gonna say, baby, that ain't enough. You gotta take care of me, you know what I mean? Not just physically, not just, not just materially, you understand? And so you got the blues songs with this one sad blues song where some brother is calling another brother who's up in there wearing his clothes and sleeping with his wife and wants to know what has he got that he didn't have. What kind of man are you? Get that boy and throw him out of the house. Of course, your wife is probably going to go with him because there's a reason why she's with him and not with you. That's why you got the blues. You understand? That's why the blues are so bad. You understand? It's real. It ain't no joke, you know? So what about the twin lineal model's application to Black families today? Today, when most Black men have been priced out of the family to the point of only 29% in it, too many sisters finding themselves alone, and some adjusting to it. I had a former student, she's probably a lawyer now, she was in law school when she told me this, that, on weekends, she didn't have a man, so she rent a man, R-E-N-T, rent a man. Now that's some true desperation, you understand? But she knew this man wasn't good for anything but a physical relationship. What a shame. And some of us are now getting used to being single, but we don't want to be, So the question is, how can we use this twin lineal model to revitalize our families and extended family communities? Most functional Black families already use these models. They just don't know, they don't have a name for it. Functional Black families basically have what's going for them, as Dr. Wade Nobles points out, a clear sense of what it is to be a man and a woman. Most Black families, functional or not, know that. And then there is an interchange of roles. And so this is how Black families have functioned quite well. That's a twin lineal inheritance because it means that you're not rigidly confined to this masculine thing, which in the West is patriarchy, or even to the feminine thing. And in some Black families, the man is more nurturing than the woman, though most often the woman is. And sometimes the man's a better cook than the woman, though very often the woman is, a lot of times the men are. You know what I mean? So we don't have this rigid thing when it comes to relationships. That's your twin lineal inheritance. That's based on masculine and feminine qualities, but clarity on what it is to be a man and a woman. A key to applying the twin lineal family model to revitalizing African families and extended family communities is mutual respect. Mutual respect for the intelligence of each other. This is real key. A key for this model to work is the removal of the idea of dominance. You can't have dominance if you're going to have justice. You hear me? And so we've inherited this white boys model of patriarchy. And so a lot of men still think that they can just tell somebody what to do. Well, first of all, that's dictatorship and that's oppression. But secondly, that's also stupid because you need to get all the ideas that are floating and go with the best idea. The reason why I ain't lost no battles is I do listen. I'm running my mouth right here, but I'm a good listener. You hear me? I listen. And my wives I've had two, are strong. And it's by purpose. I pick strong women. The people in my groups are all strong. You hear me? They all think they're smarter than me. That's why I got you, because I want good ideas. You know what I mean? But I'm gonna tell you, if you're coming up with some bull, it ain't gonna work. You know what I mean? But if you got, and me, you're gonna point out to me if it's bull. Because a friend of mine who's a mathematician said 97% of our ideas are no good. So if you're aware of that, you need to clear things out in the family. So removing dominance and placing an emphasis on cooperation of masculine and feminine, male and female, and that allows love to really exist in a family, you understand, between men and women, because love is based on respect. Have you ever heard this thing in a family where sisters or brothers say, I still love you, but don't respect you? That's the end of love. I used to not understand that, but I finally got the message. You know what I mean? Huh? If respect goes out the window, love is soon going to follow. You know what I mean? So operationally, this formula for twinlineal families is not rigid, it's flexible. So it can be applied in different ways according to the needs of the family. And that's in functional Black families, that's how it works. It requires masculine feminine synthesis, meaning that males need to be more sensitive, females need to be strong. You need to accentuate the weak side, you know? And for men, that really requires work. I know, because I had to work on it. And sisters usually have strength, but sisters also have their imbalances. They got to work on it, because that's what enables a relationship to work, not big egos that are bouncing off of each other. So when we're able to synthesize masculine and feminine, the nurturing qualities of the female, the creative qualities of the male, that allows us to be creative. And that's where creativity comes from. It comes through synthesis. But males and females need to be balanced. You can't have balance of masculine and feminine, you have no sexual definition. That means if you got equal masculine, feminine qualities, you're in the la-di-da category. You know what I mean? And I'm not knocking it if that's your way, but I'm saying you're not going to be clear about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. But balance of males and females, that's the key to everything. And in an age in which it's a high-tech economy, in which creativity is real key in terms of people surviving, then we need the union of male and female, the synthesis of masculine and feminine, so that we can draw from the creativity of each other to create families that are also economic workshops that can build us economic power and build a stronger people. That's it, Hotep.
Oh man, that is, oh man, that's great. Uncle Job Seneb, long life to you. Dr. Obatashaka, that was outstanding.
Fantastic.
Coming to us today with that message. I thought you weren't a preacher, but you certainly are a teacher and a researcher, and I'm just overwhelmed. So we're going to open it up now for question and answers. I'm going to change the screen a little bit. Let's see, how did I do that? Oh, here we go.
So I think I went 7 minutes over. For me, that's pretty good.
You know what that is, man? You have really no, just kidding. Sebastian, what are you doing here, man? Wow. Okay. Now let's try to do this orderly. Okay. Who has good? Okay, Bill has his hand raised. Go ahead, Bill.
Do you see? I heard gentleman talking about, Kali Akuno was talking about people's assemblies, and I'm not sure where that really works. That seems a very democratic form, but I'm not quite sure how to apply it. He was working in Jackson, Mississippi, and I really don't understand his work. It seems sort of obscure and not visible, so I'm not quite sure where to go with that.
You're talking about Kwame Ture?
You know, Kali Akuno, who's leading a thing called Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm sure that term people's assemblies has come up before, not just there, but it's basically a form where basically you gather everyone and then decide what are the priorities and who's going to do what.
Yeah, well, our movements, when they work best, draws from that. And when they work worse, don't draw from that. So it's not hard to understand how it works. I mean, if you look at, for example, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, out of which some of this comes, it was group-centered leadership based on Ella Baker's teachings, but it comes out of these hunter-gatherer societies where everybody has a say-so. Generally, the people are the leaders, and you come up with a consensus. In the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which I led from 63 to 66, a 10,000 person movement that defeated the entire economic power structure, organized 45,000 Black people block by block, the only block organizing done in the country, and built King Garvey housing cooperatives, which I built along with a guy named Jim Montgomery. I got 4 square blocks of land in San Francisco for $1. What you think of that? It was about worth 200 or 300 million. How could I do that? I wielded power, you know what I mean? But the key thing is the success of that movement was based on the input of the people. Why did we take on jobs? People said they wanted it. So this Jackson, Mississippi thing you're talking about, I know that the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, his father had been, Chokwe Lumumba had been mayor before, the son is mayor now. That's the way it works best. And if you don't do that, you're relying on a handful of people and they're going to make mistakes, but more often they're not going to know what the people want. You know what I mean? So it ain't that hard to figure out. It's your culture. The question is, let me finish. The question is your ego small enough to make it work?
I'm still struggling to understand how, being as fractured as we are in 2022, you assemble enough coherence to make it work.
Who says we're fractured? Black communities have been broken and stuff, but have you seen Black Lives Matter? Did you see what happened with them? 50 states and 50 countries. You understand? And how did they do that? Networking with various groups using Twitter and using various social media. You understand? They had so many groups inside of groups and stuff like that. And that's what kicked Trump out of the White House. You hear me?
Okay.
His mismanagement of COVID-19 and the way in which that movement around the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor killings riled up the world. But for that, you'd have fascism, crypto-fascism in the White House right now. You understand? So yeah, we have fragmentation of communities, but we also have the ability to come together. And that was one of the biggest coming togethers in our history. Do we note that? Put that in your head when you're doing a critique. And that's because the youth studied those movements. You hear me? Melina Abdullah, one of the best organizers, who is chair of Black Studies at Cal State Los Angeles, one of those among many that studied that movement. Why? Because at a time in which Black communities have been fractured, singular leaders will not work anymore. I've been arguing this for 30 years. Singular leaders are horse and buggy. It's the horse and buggy stage. First, if they're able to do anything, they'll kill them. But secondly, the problems are too complex for single leaders to master. And so what you need is group-centered leadership, which leadership all over the place are what the Black Lives Matter calls leader full. You know what I mean? Full of leaders. You know what I mean? So that's how it works. It's already worked. Look at what's working. That worked. Now it's sporadic because when you're dealing with police violence, you're going up against the state. You're likely to get killed. You're protesting murders. You know what I mean? So it takes guts to get in the streets. You know what I mean? And so people are going to do that sporadically, but it's a movement. Starting with Ferguson, a movement. Young people put that together. That's also proof some of them are making the right cultural choices.
All right, good question, Bill. Brother Katabazi, one Leo to another. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. T. Shaka, for joining us this evening and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. I'm wondering with the disintegration of the Black family can we attribute any of that to the urbanization of Black people?
I wouldn't call it disintegration. It's the weakening of the Black family, but it's one that we can revitalize. Yeah, urbanization contributed, but urbanization is not the primary cause, because if you look at urbanization, it begins with the migration out of the South. And in World War I, you have pretty heavy migration, and then World War II, a real heavy migration, to work in war industries. And while there's some erosion based on coming into urban settings that are more material, individualistic based, these communities are still strong. But it's when you get these hits that come in. And particularly, and this is the real key thing to get straight, in Europe, you have some drugs in Black communities. Their intelligence agencies wasn't dropping them on their communities the way they dropped them on ours for a lot of reasons. But the key thing is, if you look at Europe, and even though communities have been attacked and families have been attacked, they have not had the level of erosion that we've had here, because you have a social safety net. You know what I mean? What you have is, if you go to prison, you come out, you have a job, you get a house, to stay in. And there's actual real effort at rehabilitation in prison. But here, I didn't go into this, neoliberalism. How many people familiar with neoliberalism? Raise your hand. Yeah, that's privatizing everything in sight. The simple way to put it is taking everything that comes out of your tax dollars and putting it into private hands. That's what's happened with the privatization of education, but it's across the board. That was used to end welfare, while corporations get welfare. That's the basis for their wealth. So as a result, we now have Black communities that literally have nothing. Food deserts, nothing in those communities. No jobs, no nothing. So what do you expect to happen when that happens? And that's the decision of the rich to take everything. So that is pronounced here in this country, pronounced. Why do you think suicide rate's so high? Across the board with whites, it's gone up even more, but it's rising among our youth because some of them feel there's no hope. We've lived in worse circumstances. So you would say, why the suicide rates now? Because with the choice between two cultures, we're also taking on alien mentalities, where we think that if something's bad, that's the only way it can be. But in our culture, bad is good. I don't care how bad a situation is, you can see the other side. But some of us feel, youth, that they're frozen. So when you have a 7 to 11-year-olds having the highest suicide rate in the country, you can't blame 7 to 11-year-olds. They don't see hope. You hear me? And you're going to take the most, and the ways in which they kill themselves, strangling yourself to death, hanging yourself. And this isn't just with Blacks who are on the bottom, who, just poor. Some of them are middle-class Blacks, highly achieving. It's a value thing there, and an economic thing, and a death thing. What's the saying in the streets? I'm not afraid to die, I'm afraid to live. What happens when death is more certain than life? And that ain't all behind just Black kids shooting each other. That's a system that's shooting them. You hear me? So these are things that have to change. And so part of my point is revolutionary. You got to take the best out of your past and apply it to the present. One of the things that I do with my stuff, I've innovated 6 areas. You got to apply it to your life now. It's not a matter of waiting until the system collapses. We won't be around for that anyway. And it ain't going to collapse on its own, contrary to popular opinion. So you got to be able to take the best of your past and apply it in your life now. So twin linealism is one. Apply that to your families. Live it now. Because how are you going to create just societies if you're not recreating just people right now? Or another one of my innovations that comes with a guy named Bulin Leila Wabogo.
Wow. Wow.
We both innovated this, sixfold stages to mental freedom. We track the stages that Black people go through when they're waking up. And so the people that have gone through the organizations that I've led, they're taken through transformation. The show that I have, the Dr. Oba Tashaka show that comes on every Saturday at 10 in the morning, and we've done about 89 of them now. You can hit them anytime you want to. We're signing people up for a 12-month webinar that'll be on the sixfold stages to mental freedom. But that webinar is going to require that you be actively engaged in your community and community programs, because you're not going to change your consciousness unless you're doing something to serve your people. This ain't no intellectual exercise where you're just reading books. You know what I mean? So these can be applied right now. Why was Malcolm so bad? That's good. He went through that. Why the Black Panther Party have contradictions? They didn't. You hear me? So what we can take from the past, we need to apply it now and then work it out. And that's the basis for how you restructure societies.
All right. The conscious Rasta. Go on, brethren.
I want to say greetings to you all, and what a joy, what a treat it is to be in the presence of our wise and esteemed elder this evening, Dr. Oba Tashaka. It is a joy to be with you, Baba. I have two questions. I want to make them very brief. They both center around the idea of demographics or the demographic dividend. Population numbers have always been a strongly determining factor in the evolution of societies and civilizations. Since 1960, Afri-Amer total fertility rate has declined from 4.17 childbirths per woman in 1960 to a 2020 figure of 1.77, which is significantly below replacement rate. How does our wise and esteemed leadership propose that we might reverse this demographic decline?
That's the question. And you're referring to Black fertility rates? Is that what
Yeah, Afri-Amer Black fertility rates, yes.
Okay, you got to put it in a context. It's still above zero and it's better than whites. And we're at a time in which the demographic shift is across the board. So it would be good if we could raise those rates. I think one way is to improve the lives of our people. You know, that can lead to producing more children. So we know that when people get to a certain level of prosperity, they tend to want to have fewer children. So that's also another reality. But here's the key point. The big demographic shift is that by 2044, 2047, the majority in this country is going to be Black, brown, red, and yellow. That's the big demographic shift. And whites are going to continue to decline in numbers. State of California already reflects it. So it'd be good to up the reproduction fertility rate of Blacks. And there are a lot of things working against the two in terms of the state that doesn't want us to fertilize and reproduce. But the key thing is we're a part of a growing demographic. And that growing demographic is brown, Black, yellow, and red. And that is going to, the first shift is going to be numerical, numbers. We tend to discount everything, but if you're a strategist, you don't. What you know is American power is based first on demographics. Native destructive mentality of genocide. With this demographic shift, there's going to be struggles for power. And this demographic shift is reflected in the global shift of power of America's going down and China's going up. And at a certain point, Africa's going to come up. Africa's going to take longer because of the damage done by colonialism. Mm-hmm. And we've had our own problems due to the damage done by slavery. So it's going to take longer. But Africans are reproducing at a higher rate. So that ain't the real issue. The real issue is getting rid of the vestiges of colonialism, of which the European nation state is the biggest one. We think neocolonialism is rule indirectly economically. The biggest problem is Africans are governed by the European nation state model. And we have to draw from the best of our governance models to do something different. The Japanese were able to modernize in the Meiji Restoration because they didn't have colonialism on their shores. So that what they could do is then draw from Japanese models to industrialize their country. Now they went the imperialist route, but they knocked off the Russians in the Sino-Japanese War, the first time that people of color defeated a European nation with technology, because we had defeated them without technology. You know, the Battle of Adwa, Setawayo's battle, Islandu, and others. You know, so the key thing for us is we need to be preparing for this demographic shift. Here's the key point, and I'll leave you with this one. We underestimate our power. The Latino technically is a fastest growing group. And what's being missed is the Chinese are growing very rapidly. That's often missed, you know. But the key point is this. The Latino, that term Latino doesn't describe an ethnic group. It describes a linguistic group. So within it, you've got Black Latinos, whether it's Puerto Rican, Cuban, or Haitian, or whatever. You understand? So that's reality number one. But the key point is this. The culture of popular choice in this country is ours. And what drives social change is our culture. I led a movement, San Francisco Freedom Movement. It gave birth to the free speech movement. You hear me? It gave birth to the experimental college that gave birth to Black studies. If you look at the Black Panther Party, they gave birth to the Brown Berets. And if you look at King, it gave birth to the struggle against, the grape boycott. It inspired that. It's the nature of our struggle. And so what we have to understand, and it doesn't mean our culture alone is going to govern here, it's going to be a mix. Most nationalists don't appreciate this, but there's going to be alliances and coalitions, and the question is who runs them. But the key point is we have to be prepared for the shift, and we have to be prepared for preparing our children to handle that, to create just societies. King and Malcolm reached the conclusion by the end of their life, and we've done it on the Dr. Obotishaka show, we've done a couple of shows on this, Manu Ampin on the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King, showing that by the end of his life, King, well, actually by 65, King had concluded the society needed to be restructured. Malcolm reached the same conclusion. And what are you restructured around? The best of your culture. King didn't have that to draw from, but he appreciated the need for the change. Malcolm was drawing from it, but King was very advanced in what he was doing. That is the path for transformation. While we are struggling to rebuild communities, rebuild families, empower ourselves economically, educate our children. I did a series of shows on Black power and Afrocentrism, starting with the SS State Strike and ended with the most successful movement for community control of the schools in the United States. We need to look at models. We have models, but we act like we don't. And so I led the movement around African-centered education in the National Black United Front. Our best chapter was Kansas City. And the best model for controlling education was the Kansas City educational public school model, where for 22 years, 1,200 Black students were educated under a $9 million budget that was cut loose from the public schools, put in the hands of the Black community, and these kids scored at the highest level. Asa Hilliard and others were coming in, Wade Nobles and others, helping to strengthen that curriculum. Now, they had one person on the Board of Education that produced that. So what happens if you have 6? But we think we can't control our own education. Like hell you can't. As you think, so you are. And then in that city also, they have the best Saturday school program called the W.B. Du Bois Learning Center. It's been in operation now 50 years. average 200 students a year being taught science, mathematics, reading, writing, math, being taught history and culture. A brother named Leon Dixon set this up. He's done all the coursework for a PhD in mathematics. They wouldn't pass him on the orals. If you pass all the courses, you pass the orals. But his friend was told by one of them that was doing the orals, we ain't never passing no Black person with a PhD in mathematics. You know what I mean? But he's run this thing. You know what I mean? So we have models. We need to take the best models that we have produced to revitalize our communities. You hear me? And so that's a part of it. So it's creating just societies, not just any society. You had a second question?
Brother Keedy, you said you had two questions, but I'm going to ask you to hold your second question because we have four other people. And that was a great question. And I hope you're not disappointed by that. Sister Judy, Brother Amadi, Brother John, Minister Makalisi.
Greetings. Hi, Dr. Tishaka. I'm so happy to finally have a chance to be in your presence on Zoom. I'm originally from Tuskegee, and I don't know if you've ever come there to be a professor or adjunct, but my question was, you mentioned earlier that, well, this is a comment first. You mentioned earlier that the nationalists base, they base a lot of their thoughts or have some, I guess you should say, put a lot of blame on slavery. And that may not be exactly what you were saying, but I was wondering, you said slavery. I would think that slavery has affected us all the way through, because slavery, and when I think of slavery, I think of us not having power of ourselves. We're dependent, and there was ownership of us when we were slaves. And all the way through, we've had, from physical slavery, it turned into mental slavery. And we're still kind of dealing with slavery, to me, all the way. And so I was thinking, when we think about ownership, that's one of the things that really makes us a slave today, is the fact of our lack of ownership of anything, with our music industry being owned by others. So I was trying to get a little bit more clarity on why you were saying nationalists, should not hold slavery as being. And then you mentioned at the end about our mental steps, steps for mental freedom. So I was thinking that we still have really been affected by slavery all along.
So you didn't really listen to what I said.
I may have missed it.
What I said was, in the post-68 period, things have happened to the Black community that you cannot attribute to slavery. I didn't say that slavery didn't continue to pose problems for Black people. For example, the erosion of the extended family community, that ain't got nothing to do with slavery. It was created during slavery. You understand? The erosion has occurred through the attacks on the Black community, through drugs, breaking up Black communities, and a host of other things. Or this choice between two cultures that I was just describing, that's a new phenomenon, because in slavery, see, here's the point about slavery. Slavery did its damage, but we didn't come out the crippled people that we've been made out to be either. We came out with crippling effects of slavery. We didn't come out a crippled people. The first thing we came out with was scars, but our humanity intact. What's the proof of that? When slavery is ended, you have all of these orphans. I'm giving one example. There's a million examples of this. All these orphans running all over the South, because in the Civil War, Black families were separated. And so when the Freedmen Bureau is created, one of the purposes is to take care of these children. Guess what? There were no children to take care of, because Black people took care of them. You hear me? And that was because of the residual of communalism, of sharing. Zora Neale Hurston, who's one of the best students of African-American culture, makes this point. The closer we were to slavery, the more African we were. You hear me? So there's the negative side of slavery, but there's the positive side. And the positive side is you were closest to Africa. And therefore, if you want to look at the generations of blacks who had the greatest pride, they're the ones closest to slavery. They're the royal ones. They're the ones who carry themselves with the most dignity, have the least, but inside have the most. Carter G. Woodson made this observation about formerly enslaved Black people. He said they were so generous, they were generous to a fault, that if a Black man or woman had 25 cents and another person needed it, give them the whole 25 cents. You hear me? And if you want to look at the inventions of our people, where did the greatest number of inventions come from right after slavery? Have you looked at all of that? George Washington Carver was an ex-slave. By the way, when he was going to go to school, he's about 11 years old. He was in a barn, and then a Black woman took him in, as was common. And so she said, "What's your name?" He said, "I'm Carver's George." She said, "No, you're not owned by any," but it didn't mean that he believed that he was property. But the key point is, you want to look at George Washington Carver? The greatest scientist in the 20th century was an ex-slave. And guess what? His pedagogy was a pedagogy or seva that comes out of Egypt. The book I'm finishing now, or out of Kemet. The book I'm finishing now is displacing the banking system that Paulo Freire talks about, where you drop information on people. It's a system for bringing out what is in people. George Washington Carver knew that system. What did he say? You can't teach people anything. You got to bring out what is within them. Mm-hmm. That came from the African in our culture. And he was in Kansas, where there weren't hardly any Black people, but he was as African as you could get. You hear me? So I'm making two comments here. One is slavery did its damage, but we've overestimated the damage, and we haven't looked at the strengths. And we don't seem to have accounted for the fact we created a culture in slavery. We created an art form in slavery. You hear me? And here, I'm going to make another point here. Observers of enslaved Africans would make these comments. I'm a historian, and one of my areas is African history, the other is African American. Why? You can't use one without the other. You got to use the past to apply it to you now. So these were common observations of enslaved Black people. What was the common observation? They have qualities of nobility and royalty. Enslaved Africans. So if you think they were all whipped down and broken, I'm sorry. That was not the case. Yes, some were. And some, like Frederick Douglass, who were broken, came back to life when they got that juju, from that old man, Sandy, on the plantation, that he said, as long as I carried this piece of Africa with me, no white man ever touched me. And when Frederick went up to get whipped by the slave master, Colby, he had that in his pocket. The first day he didn't get whipped. Frederick was not all that a spiritual person to begin with, you know what I mean? And so he said, well, maybe this works, but it's probably because it's Sunday. Sure enough, Monday, Colby lit into him. He never got a punch in. Frederick Douglass beat him to the ground. Why? A piece of Africa. And after that, what he said is, I had lost all sense of being a human being, but this revived me. And then what did he say? He said, any man that would attempt to put his hands on me now will have to die, because I may still be a physical slave. I'm a spiritually free person. What was the mantra of the enslaved African? Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That was the national anthem of most Black folks. You hear me? So yeah, there were the negatives of slavery, color consciousness, but not like the Caribbean, because here, you don't know if the light complexion person is proud of being Black or isn't. In the Caribbean, it usually works that way, but not always. But here, because of race consciousness, it works in a different way. You know what I mean? So as a result, we come out with scars, definitely, but with our humanity intact. It was rough kindness that those first formerly enslaved Africans had. Kind of rough, you know what I mean? But they also would take care of you. Yeah, on your butt if you were wrong, but at the same time, giving you love, Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is the post-68 period, what is happening is, so how do Black families stay intact all that time if slavery did us in? We rebuilt families in slavery, but particularly afterwards, but it's the forces since 68 that have most seriously weakened families and most seriously weakened extended family community values. And that's because the forces we're going up against then in post-68 period are invisible corporate forces. You're not wired for it. We're wired for racism. We're not wired for corporate media, bling bling. You know what I mean? You know, we're not wired for how a Ronald Reagan will come in with a economist who comes up with this idea that big government's bad and then start stripping everything. I mean, we weren't wired for that. And so as a result, the devastation is greater. So the culture now has to be more conscious of these forces. So I'm not saying that slavery didn't do its damage, but I'm saying we've exaggerated it too.
All right, Brother Amadi, Brother John, Minister Makalisi.
I'll share. I'm gonna be fast. This is absolutely inspiring. I'm just really learned so much. Thank you. For bringing up my awareness about African American culture, because I have been guilty of that as well. But I never will be again. And also about group-centered leadership. What powerful concepts among so many others. So just briefly, I want to just say that, how do you see us mitigating the threat of gentrification? And, in Los Angeles, we have a problem that it seems like the politicians are really pushing this, this agenda. I forgot what you call it. But anyway, the developers, right? The developers seem to have so much power in Los Angeles, and the politicians are just like pushing that agenda, and they're just watching our neighborhood be dismantled. What do you think about? What are some thoughts about mitigating this gentrification pattern?
One of the hardest battles you have as a community organizer is to go up against the forces of either gentrification or redevelopment. Redevelopment was just breaking down Black communities. Gentrification is bringing in other people who get all kinds of financial deals from banks and stuff, and so they can buy up housing and everything else, and then shift the color of your community. And the rising cost of housing that drives people out of their communities. So one is, to the extent that, because in California, you got a real Browning. So to the extent that you can put people in office who have a history of struggle, and particularly the mayor's office, then you have at least a chance to fight some of those forces. Corporations run cities, so that's not going to be easy. So that is one of the things that can enable you to fight it. And so Harold Washington in Chicago came in supporting the Black community. And had the Black community utilized him better, they could have benefited from it. And so one of the things I'd say is that if you can occupy City Hall, the first thing you do is occupy the blocks. Organize on the block level. The big mistake in Chicago was not to organize the block. Chicago's organized on block level. That is how the Irish mafia worked. You know what I mean? But Black nationalists lazy. They like to have these big rallies and give speeches and all this shit. And so I'm pushing constantly for this. And they're talking about, yeah, you did it, but it was top down. Yeah, I took over the poverty program and stuck all the money in the Black community. I've never taken a dime in any movement I've led. And so we organized 45,000 Black people block by block. We're the only ones that did it. And so I'm telling you, do it. Had the Panthers done it, they'd be alive, because you can bury the FBI, bury all these intelligence agencies in a sea of people. That's how the Vietnamese kicked America's behind. You know, understand? You know what I mean? So that's one level. The other level is you got to push for low and moderate income housing. And what's happened is the government is going out of that business because they're all about building condos and everything for the rich. When I built King Garvey, I went to Washington, D.C., lobbied the Senate. It wasn't me alone, it was a movement, and we got this in 1966, low and moderate income housing passed. And then I got a guy named Jim Montgomery, who's an engineer, and I had got these 4 square blocks, for $1. And then he laid out a plan and we got smart. We went to HUD and let them build it. So, because we weren't going to get no money from banks anywhere. This was 1966. I was a full-time organizer. I was broke, didn't have no credit rating, but even if I did, they weren't going to give us any money. But then what we did is we got our people and other people in there, and then they turned it into a co-op. It's called strategy, brother. Huh? They paid to build it and we took it over. What do you think of that? 211 units of housing, $170 for a 1,400 square foot unit. And I don't benefit from anything I leave. That's my code as a warrior. I wasn't homeless. I lived with my girlfriends or my father or whatever, you know what I mean? But I had no money, you know what I mean? And we had other people that I told our members, anyone that wanted to, go get one of those. But the community generally benefited from that. So we need low and moderate income housing. The other thing you need is you need to raise the ceiling for what people are paid. This $15 an hour is chicken feed. You know what I mean? 30,000 a year, you know, somewhere around there. So it's 10,000 more after taxes. What is that taken care of? You know, so we need a guaranteed annual income. That was a part of the Panthers platform, but that came from ideas that even Nixon had it in his budget, but never intended to pass it. So that means if your income's 30,000, you need another 50,000 coming from the government. And you'll say, oh, that can't be done. Well, that's because you don't fight. Because if you fight, you know it could be done because the corporations are taking everything. That defense budget is nearly $800 billion right now. Damn screwdriver is costing $1,000 or whatever. You know what I mean? And where's it going? Nowhere except the pockets of the rich. So that's a fight you have to wage. You know what I mean? And instead of this Obamacare, which was better than nothing, you need real medical care for people. And people need retirement benefits. They used to have it. You know? So those are all things you have to fight for. When you get that, that's not revolution. That's just reform. But that will enable people to live in a city and not be homeless or to have a job and you're homeless. I care about poor people more than anything. Poor Black people and then poor people. That's my main concern. You know what I mean? And so there's a lot that can be done around that. It's a fight. It's a hell of a fight. And redevelopment and gentrification is one of the hardest ones to win, but you can win it.
Ashe. Thank you, brother. Thank you. Appreciate it, Doctor.
Right, Brother John, go ahead.
First of all, let me just say, man, I am just totally blown away by the amount of information you store within your head and just spit it out. You know, I'm just blown away by that. But my question, I don't really have a question. I have a request, actually, on a more personal level. How would you, and I know you're online and you don't have a whole lot of time, but if you can just give me one of them nuggets of wisdom. I'm newly awakened. And so this, like 3 years, I'm 68 years old, 3 years into this thing, just a wealth of information that's just coming, and and I'm going through the anger and I'm realizing this and I'm realizing that, and I want to do this, and I hear you talking, community involvement, so on. What word of counsel could you offer me in helping me to process this awakening, this new understanding that 65 years, I was just your average Negro. I was then raised in Oakland. I didn't know you existed, man. I'm just right across the bay. So much that I missed. And so now at this stage of my life, trying to process all this information, man, it can be overwhelming. And you feel like, man, you feel what I'm saying?
Yeah. First of all, I would suggest you watch my show, the Dr. Oba Tshaka show.
I try.
DrObaTshaka show. And then the first thing that comes up will say that, click into it, you'll see it. And so there's a lot of stuff that will help you in terms of this journey. You're describing, so for me, when I went through this was in 1963. when I underwent my awakening. And so I was going on 23 years old. A brother named Norman Brown woke me up. He was my vice chair. And so this awakening process goes through stages. And what you're describing is you are in the early stages. It comes from one of two levels. I can't go into this now, but Black people will come from one of two levels when it comes to dealing with this awakening. But either way, there's going to be disturbance, meaning you're going to get angry, that you didn't know all this before. You experienced some of that? Yeah.
Have I ever?
Angry at the system, angry at yourself, blah,
Hey,
blah.
look at TV without seeing some racist thing going on. There's some plot going on behind this movie. And it's crazy.
So that's a natural thing, and it's a good thing because our anger is usually directed in the wrong place, inward, you know what I mean? And stress levels and all the rest of this stuff. So the fact that you're experiencing that's healthy because being oppressed, you're supposed to be angry. I mean, that's the first stage of it in any awakening process. Now, what's key is to understand the stages of awakening and as you're feeding yourself, start with the basics. So if you contact me, I'll send you an introductory reading list. But there are basics that you should start with. Most people, when they're undergoing awakening, like me, my first thing was the first book I read. It happened to be Lost Cities of Africa by Basil Davidson. That happened to be my first book.
Wow.
This was a little heavy for me.
Yeah, and I underlined it. It goes back to 63, you know what I mean? But the key point is the ideal way to do it is sequentially in terms of reading is to start with the basics. I'll give you one clue. Start with J.A. Rogers, read his stuff. Foundation stuff, because whether it's World's Great Men of Color that introduces you to the achievements of African people, it's brief, it's very brief, but it's really introducing you to civilizations. Or From Superman to Man, that one is giving you a basic description of racism. So start with the basics. If you look at Malcolm and his awakening, that was part of what triggered his stuff. And most of that stuff was brought to him by his family in prison. One of the books I've written, my first one, is The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. And Malcolm was my first master. No, my second master. Garvey was the first. So what I'd say is, while it's a lot you think you have to digest, start with the basic stuff and contact me. Brother Imhotep can give you my email address and stuff. And I'll send you a reading list, a basic reading list. You can start with the basic stuff first, And then the thing is working on yourself internally. That's internal work, So I'd advise you to consider signing up for our 6-fold Stages to Mental Freedom class. When we have 40 people, we're going to do that for a year. I mentioned this before. It'll be twice a month for a year, a couple hours each time. And I'm going to have some of the people in Pan-African People's Organization that have gone through this. They're going to be breaking people into groups of 10, and we'll take them through this process. But they have to be engaged in something in their community, because this does not work unless you do that. So understand where you're at, there are other stages. And while it may seem late, it seems that way to everybody when they wake up. Because when I did mine at 23, I was so mad that I had gone through 4 years of college and 2 years of law school, and I didn't know up from down. And I'm leading the only successful movement in the country. And I think part of the reason why I was successful is I was undergoing that awakening. Had I not, they would have cleaned my clock for sure. Yeah. So don't feel bad, feel glad.
Right, there you go. Great.
Will do.
All right. Minister Makalisi, and then we have one more question that's in the chat, and then we'll end. Great to see you, Nabantu. Good to see you. All right, brother. Go ahead, Minister Makalisi.
All right, Brother Dr. Obadishak, it's really good to be in your presence after a good many years of not having that experience. I just, you were talking about the twin lineal concept, the twin lineal consciousness that we need to cultivate and understand again. Made me think about an article I read a while back about this African group. They're still pretty much rural living, and they were saying something about these fathers in this group. I think it's the Car people. I'm not real sure. I remember exactly who they are, but the fathers. This article is saying they're probably the most effective fathers in the world. And one of the things they said about them is that when they have this, when they had men are hunters and the women are doing the agricultural work, and when the women go off to do the agricultural work, that the fathers are the babysitters, for lack of a better term, and one of the things that the fathers do to comfort the child when the child is missing mom and all the comfort that comes from being in mom's presence is the fathers allow the babies who in the first year of their lives are never left alone. The fathers allow the babies to suckle on their nipples. And they're not getting the nutrition that they get from moms, but there's that relationship that's established and strengthened. And we're talking about what's happened with our families, down to 29% of two parents in the family. So whether we get to babies suckling the father's nipples, but there's something about that dynamic that we need to understand, and get ourselves back up to 75, 80, 90, 100% of men, women, fathers, and mothers that are together in the family that are leading and guiding the children. And one thing relating to that I'm noticing with a young niece, a great niece, that's breastfed by her mother, and of course her mother has a job, and I'm over at the sister-in-law's house where the child is kept during the day while the mother is working. But no matter how much fun is going on, what kind of activity is going on, when mom hits that door, the world changes. That baby doesn't want to have any. She's 2 years old now. She doesn't have anything to do with anything else. Say, Mom, eat, and she gets and orders her mom almost, get that nipple in my mouth. And so, you're bringing the twin lineal thing that just made that click in my head, click in my mind. But we got to find ways to get ourselves to understand that, our children need that connection with their fathers as much as with their mothers. And it's the balance, as you pointed out, as you were making the presentation. I was just relating that. And finally, where we tune into your show, your program, the Dr. Obadishaka program?
The address is H as in Harry, TTP : / B as in boy, IT .ly / DROBA show, or just put in Dr. Obadishaka show and go to the page and click into it, and you'll see the channel either way. Your comment, first of all, it's good to see you, Minister Makalisi.
I see.
I have a lot of respect for you. You did.
Thank you, my brother.
With Woze.
Respect you likewise.
Your brother has a lot of integrity. I really respect you, Your comment is in part an outgrowth, again, of Twa hunter-gatherer family practices, where the men did as much caring for the children as the women. And so subsequent African societies that picked that up, and all of them didn't, are drawing from that. And so they were nurturers, they would carry the children and everything else. So that's where that comes from. Kindness is like the core of African culture. It's the core of New African culture. And one of the greatest erosions is some of the meanness that has come in, because if people get attached to material things and get oriented towards violence and stuff like that, and some of that kindness gets eroded. But that is at the core of that, so yeah, that's an important point.
All right. And then Ikena in the chat, whoops, hold on just a second. Ikena put this question in the chat, and this is the last question. What do you believe the millennials and the Generation Zs can do to move our people forward?
What's the Generation Z? Is that the current generation?
Go ahead, Ikena. Why don't you, are you still there? Go ahead and address that. I would think so. I would think so, Dr. Tashaka.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, current generation. Yeah, so what I'd say is that there's a real hunger among younger Blacks for an exchange, for interaction with conscious Africans in the United States. There's a real desire for that. And what you're seeing on the internet is a lot of that popping up. And so there's a very high regard for a growing number of young Blacks towards Blacks who are conscious, Africans who are conscious. And we're being given the reverence of a John Henry Clark. That's the way they're viewing it. And the reason I'm doing the show is to reach younger people. And the age group I'm reaching is 30 on up. And I usually know, well, first of all, when you get people who subscribe, and by the way, if you go to the show, subscribe, you can tell. There's usually pictures of them, but they'll usually refer to you as "thank you, elder." That's somebody younger, you know what I mean? So there's a desire for that. And then it's a global desire, because what I'm trying to do is reach a global audience. So we're drawing people from Africa, we're drawing people from the Caribbean, and we're drawing Blacks and some whites from Europe and some from Asia. By the way, one of our biggest viewing audiences is India. So, but the main viewing audience is Blacks from this country. So that's my main concern, is reaching them. That's why I'm doing it. If I had mainly 60 and 70 years old, I'd be tuning out, because I'm tired. I've never done the talking to the choir. I don't have any problem with people my age or slightly younger, I don't have a problem with that. But if that's all I'm talking to, I'm talking to the choir. I got to be talking to younger people and then drawing them in and then getting their ideas. And some of them are volunteering their time. They call me twice a week. We have these intergenerational conversations. And sometimes they're pumping me and I have to tell them, go read the book. You got the book, you're asking me a question, it's in the book, read it. But they're also readers. And then you're finding out their background and everything else. So that's what we need. We need to be learning from the young people. One of the things I'm gonna be doing on this show, the Dr. Obert Tashaka show, is I've set up a thing called a leadership training academy called Per Ankh House of Life, Amilcar Cabral, Ella Baker Leadership Institute. Per Ankh was the highest university in ancient Kemet. And so what I'm doing is adapting that system. The book I'm finishing now is dealing with the African method for teaching, their Seba, and I'm adapting this to modern times. So it's centered on the leadership style of Ella Baker, which is group-centered. Amilcar Cabral, who you see the guy in the sunglasses over here, sunglasses, that's the greatest leader of the 20th century. How many people knew of Amilcar Cabral? Raise your hands. Yeah, okay. Greatest leader of the 20th century. When I say that, greater than Mao, Zedong of China, greater than Ho Chi Minh, greater than Castro, greater than Malcolm, greater than Garvey. Best organizer, best thinker, best military leader, and a person that also went through this six-fold stages of mental freedom. That's one of the reasons why he was so good. So we're going to be doing organizing / leadership training. And one of the reasons I'm drawing from models like the Kansas City and others is using models to train people in how to rebuild their communities, and drawing on young people and older people who have been successfully organizing around the country. So that's also one of the purposes for this. You know.
Well, we have really been fed. He mentioned earlier that some men are the best cooks, and we have been fed this evening. This is the first time we've ever gone over this long, but we just didn't want to end. Excellent, thought-provoking, revolutionary spirit, educational pedagogy. I mean, the adjectives, I could just go on and on. Thank you, Seba. Thank you, Dr. Obatishaka, for giving us the information. And yes, subscribe to his YouTube channel. You can just go to YouTube and type in his name and then hit the subscribe button. And he's on YouTube and other places other than his channel as well. I want to thank everyone for coming and staying and being a part of this. This is historic to me. This is historic. I'm glad to see so many of my old friends and my fellows my fellows and Sistren, Idrin and Sistren, as the Rastas would say, in the struggle. Give thanks. See you next time. Next week, we're going to be talking about the HBCUs with Sugar D and Sister Judy. So tune in next week.